She suffered in the countryside until a millionaire rancher saved her and changed her life. Before we begin, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. And if you like love stories, make sure to subscribe to the channel. That way, you help me keep bringing more emotional stories and make the channel grow more and more. Grace Sullivan was only 27 years old, but her intense blue eyes carried a sadness that seemed decades old. Her fair skin, marked by faint freckles, contrasted with the deep dark circles that the cracked bathroom mirror reflected back at her every morning. Her thin body and calloused fingers revealed a life of hard work, even as the world outside insisted on moving forward without noticing her existence. On that cold October morning, the cutting wind of Montana's countryside swept dust along the dirt road leading to the small, rundown farm where she lived with her half-brother Lucas, who was just 10 years old. The wooden cabin, once a cheerful home, now threatened to collapse with every new gust of wind. The roof had holes covered by torn tarps, and the pasture, once lush and green, was now a dry field where fallen fences and an abandoned silo set the scene of a life on the verge of collapse. Grace pulled her worn-out flannel jacket tighter against her body and went out to feed the few remaining chickens in the rusty coop. As she scattered corn on the dry ground, she heard Lucas's weak, persistent cough coming from inside the house. Her chest tightened. He was getting more and more fragile, and she knew she couldn't afford another medicine or a doctor's visit. "Stay in bed, Lucas. I'll be right back, okay?" said Grace, forcing a smile as she entered the narrow room where the boy curled up under a thin blanket, his face pale and his green eyes feverish. Lucas just nodded, too weak to speak. Grace stroked, his light brown hair feeling the urgency growing in her chest. She couldn't fail. She couldn't let the tragedy that took their parents' lives also take her brother. The memory of that fateful night still haunted her. The dry phone call from the police, the confirmation of the accident on the frozen road. And suddenly, she, a young woman who barely knew how to take care of herself, found herself responsible for a child and a property drowning in debt. Grace closed her eyes for a second, swallowing the sob that wanted to burst out. There was no room for weakness. The bank had already sent 3 eviction notices, and the next letter she knew would be the final order. She grabbed the old key of the blue pickup truck, parked next to the barn, and climbed into the cab with a tired sigh. The engine coughed, resisted but didn't start. "Please, not now," she whispered, resting her forehead against the steering wheel as silent tears streamed down her face. She tried once more, and the engine finally roared, weak but alive. Grace wiped her face with the sleeve of her shirt and put it in gear, driving to the nearest town, Bozeman, almost an hour away. She needed to buy antibiotics for Lucas, even if it meant spending the last bit of money she had hidden in the cookie jar in the kitchen. Halfway down the dirt road, the unexpected happened. The truck started smoking and losing power. Grace pulled over to the shoulder, got out, and lifted the hood, letting out a muffled scream when she saw the burst hose. "No, this can't be," she said, her voice choked, kicking the wheel with restrained anger. Alone in the middle of nowhere, with her sick brother and no money to call a tow truck, she looked around, searching for a miracle that seemed farther and farther away. The grey, oppressive sky reflected exactly how she felt, suffocated, exhausted, invisible. She clung to the amulet she always wore around her neck, a silver pendant, her mother's inheritance, and whispered as she did, "Every night, give me strength. I just need a little more strength." At that moment, she felt more alone than ever, not knowing that this would be the day that would change her life forever. Grace was still standing by the broken-down truck, feeling the icy wind cut through her thin, pale skin, when the memory of the last conversation with the bank manager invaded her mind like a knife, If you don't pay by the end of the month, we'll be forced to take the property, Miss Sullivan." Those words echoed repeatedly in her head, like a hammer breaking. Her last defenses. She squeezed her eyes shut tightly, trying to push that voice away, but it was useless. Every time she crossed paths with someone she knew in town, she felt their looks pierce her skin like sharp needles. "There she is, the unlucky orphan," they would mutter behind her back. Grace had heard that more times than she could count. Even those who once had lunch at her parents' house now crossed the street to avoid facing her. In that place, where everyone knew each other, being marked as a burden was a cruel sentence. "They think I'm a curse," she muttered to herself, taking a deep breath to hold back the tears that kept threatening to fall. Suddenly, Lucas's weak, intermittent cough coming from the direction of the truck brought her back to the urgency of the moment. He remained curled up in the passenger seat, hugging the worn-out jacket that was too big for his small, frail body. His pale face contrasted with the green eyes dulled by the fever. "It's going to be okay, Lou. I promise," said Grace, forcing her voice to sound firm. Even when inside, she felt like she was falling apart. He didn't answer, just clutched the worn-out teddy bear he had been carrying since their parents' accident even tighter. Grace knew she couldn't just stand there, but the open hood and the smoke still coming from the engine said otherwise. The cold was getting worse, and the sky was starting to close in with heavy clouds, threatening yet another storm that week. The horizon, dotted with distant grey mountains, seemed as unreachable as any hope that might still remain. She looked at the old silver pendant around her neck, a gift from her mother when she was still a child, and squeezed it between her frozen fingers. "If you were here, you'd know what to do," she whispered, feeling the emptiness inside her chest grow like an open wound. The weight of that lonely life was crushing. Since the tragedy, Grace had taken on all the responsibilities that the adults in town thought she'd never be able to handle. And in truth, she herself didn't know how she still managed to wake up every day. It was like living inside an invisible prison, without bars but with walls built by the disdain and indifference of those who should have helped her. At the last town hall meeting, when she tried to ask for support for families like hers, she heard one of the council members say, "Maybe it's time for you to accept that you can't keep this property. Not everyone is made for the countryside." Those words had hurt more than any debt or threat. It wasn't just about the farm, it was about her identity, about her story. The wind blew harder, causing her wavy blonde hair to come loose from the messy bun, spreading stray strands over her tired face. She lifted her gaze to the overcast sky, as if searching for an answer where she no longer expected to find anything. Suddenly, the distant sound of an engine approaching along the dirt road interrupted her thoughts. She turned quickly, shielding her eyes from the dust, as a black, sturdy and shiny truck appeared around the bend. It wasn't common to see vehicles like that around those parts. Grace's heart raced, not knowing if this was a sign of help or just another problem. "Who could that be?" she murmured, instinctively clutching her mother's pendant. As the vehicle got closer, the old pickup let out one more agonizing sigh and died for good, leaving the silence and the cold to take over the landscape. The high beams lit up the open hood, Grace's fragile body beside it, and in the passenger seat, Lucas, asleep and feverish. She stood there, motionless, her gaze torn between her brother and that unknown truck that was slowly stopping a few meters ahead, making the ground tremble under its thick tires. At that moment, without knowing it, Grace was about to cross the invisible boundary of that silent prison that had been suffocating her for years. But she couldn't yet imagine that the life up to then made only of losses and loneliness was about to change forever. "Come on. Just keep breathing, Grace. Just keep breathing," she murmured to herself as she took a hesitant step toward the figure climbing down from the truck. And that's how, amid the rising dust and the muffled sound of a distant thunder, Destiny finally began to move. Grace stood still, her heart pounding, as she saw the door of the black truck slowly open, the metallic creak mixed with the distant sound of thunder, while fine raindrops began to sprinkle the packed dirt ground. She pulled her flannel jacket tighter against her body, shielding herself from the cold and the uncertainty of that moment. From inside the vehicle, a tall man stepped out, with a strong and confident build. His brown leather boots sank slightly into the damp earth with each firm step he took. He wore dark jeans, a blue and white plaid shirt, and a heavy coat, typical of someone who knows the harshness of the countryside well. On his head, a black cowboy hat partially shaded his face, but didn't hide his strong and striking features. As he approached, Grace could make out the dark green eyes analyzing her with an expression hard to decipher, somewhere between the coldness of someone used to not trusting anyone and an involuntary curiosity sparked by the scene in front of him. Cole Bennett. She recognized him immediately, even though they had never exchanged a word. He was the owner of the largest ranch in the region, heir to one of Montana's oldest and most respected families. But he was also known for another reason: his coldness, the voluntary isolation after the tragedy that years ago had turned him into a distant and quiet man. Grace felt a chill, not just from the cold, but from the imposing presence of that man. She thought about explaining herself, about saying something, but her throat was too dry, as if all the words had been lost along with the last hope she had that morning. Cole quickly looked at the pickup with the open hood, and then at her. His gaze briefly passed over the passenger seat, where Lucas slept, curled up under the jacket. "Problems?" he asked, his voice deep but surprisingly calm. Grace took a deep breath, struggling to keep her composure. "The hose burst, and I don't have any tools to fix it," she replied, avoiding looking directly at him, as if her wounded pride wouldn't allow her to appear weak. Cole nodded, taking off the leather gloves he was wearing and approaching the engine with the ease of someone who grew up in that kind of environment. "Let me take a look." Grace frowned, surprised by his willingness to help, considering everything she'd heard about him. She watched in silence as he examined the engine, moving skillfully among the rusty parts. The rain was gradually getting heavier, wetting the blonde strands that had escaped her messy bun and sticking them to her pale face. "Do you live around here?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the engine. Grace hesitated before answering. "The Sullivan farm, about 6 miles south." Her voice came out low, almost ashamed, as if that name no longer carried the respect it once did. Cole quickly looked up, recognizing the surname, but chose not to comment. "I've got a spare hose in the truck. It'll take a few minutes." Without asking for permission, he turned and walked to the vehicle, easily opening the back. Grace stayed there, watching, not knowing if this was really happening or just another mirage built by exhaustion. The wind picked up, spreading the dust mixed with rain, while she hugged her arms around her body, trying to protect herself from the cold and the feeling of vulnerability. Suddenly, she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. She turned quickly and saw Cole holding out a thick jacket. "Put this on. It's going to get even colder." Grace looked at him, surprised, not knowing what to say. She didn't want to seem fragile, but her body was trembling uncontrollably. "Thank you," she murmured, accepting the jacket and immediately feeling the warmth of the heavy fabric over her shoulders. While Cole returned to the engine to finish the repair, she shifted her gaze to Lucas, still asleep, breathing with difficulty. The fear of not being able to get him to the doctor tightened her chest like an impossible knot. A few minutes later, Cole firmly closed the hood and wiped his hands on his jeans. "It'll hold until you get to town, but you need to replace that part. For good. It could leave you stranded again." Grace nodded, relieved, but still unable to believe the unexpected kindness. "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." Cole looked at her for a second longer, as if trying to figure out the story. Behind this woman, so fragile and yet so determined. "You don't have to say anything," he replied, turning to head back to his truck. Grace watched as he opened the door, about to leave, but something inside her, maybe desperation, maybe hope, made her call out to him on impulse. "Wait! Wait!" Cole stopped, resting his hand on the door, and slightly turned his head, waiting for her to continue. Grace took a deep breath, clutching the silver pendant between her trembling fingers. "Thank you. Really." He gave a brief nod, almost imperceptible, and got into the truck, starting the engine that roared strongly on the empty road. She stood there, watching the vehicle slowly disappear into the dust and rain, until silence once again ruled. Grace looked again at the repaired pickup, at her brother, and finally at the cloudy horizon. She didn't know yet, but that encounter, so simple and unexpected, would end up changing everything. The rain picked up, and she got into the pickup, taking a deep breath before turning the key and putting the vehicle in motion, not realizing that at that very moment, Cole was watching her from a distance in the rearview mirror, intrigued by the quiet strength of that unknown woman. In the days that followed the encounter on the road, the rain seemed relentless, soaking the dry fields and making the roads even harder to navigate. Grace drove the patched-up pickup to Bozeman, managed to buy a weak antibiotic for Lucas, and came back home exhausted, believing that it would just be another chapter in the long story of silent survival she shared with her brother. But his cough didn't stop. Every night she woke up with a start from Lucas's violent coughing fits as he curled up under the thin blankets, his face pale, the dark circles under his eyes deepening. Grace sat by his side, soaked cloths in cold water to try to bring down the fever, and stroked his light brown hair, whispering words that sounded more like prayers than comfort. "You're going to be okay, I promise." But even she didn't believe that anymore. On the morning of the third day, with her eyes burning from exhaustion and her heart tight with helplessness, she heard the sound of a vehicle approaching along the dirt road, breaking the gloomy silence that surrounded the farm. She stood up from the rotting wooden porch where she had been sitting and adjusted her worn-out coat. The wet dust announced the arrival of a large, imposing black truck, one she recognized immediately: Cole Bennett. He parked in front of the collapsed fence and calmly stepped out, wearing the same leather boots, dark jeans, and the hat that shaded his enigmatic gaze. Grace stood still, not moving, her arms crossed like an invisible armor, as he approached with the calm confidence of someone used to mastering any terrain. "Good morning, Grace," he greeted, his voice deep and reserved. She nodded, not hiding her discomfort. "Wasn't expecting visitors." Cole looked around, taking in the scene: the barn missing planks, the dry pasture, the porch on the verge of collapse. His gaze, however, stopped at the closed windows, as if he knew that behind them there was something or someone she was trying to protect. "I know you weren't," he replied, removing his hat in a respectful gesture. "But since that day, I've been thinking." Grace frowned, pressing her arms tighter against her chest. "Thinking about what?" He took a deep breath, as if measuring every word before saying it. "About your situation, about your brother." He paused briefly, observing her tired face, her features hardened by resilience, but worn by exhaustion. "I've got space and work at the ranch." Grace stared at him, surprised, almost as if she hadn't understood. "Work?" Cole nodded. "A steady paycheck, housing, food, and I can help with your brother's education. I have contacts who can get him enrolled in a good school in town." She let out a dry laugh, shaking her head, incredulous. "Why? Why would you do that?" Cole's gaze hardened, but there was something else there, a weariness similar to hers, a silent empathy. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything and have to start over from nothing. Grace felt her chest tighten as if those words had stripped away a layer of the protection she fought so hard to maintain. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Grace. It's work. I need someone I can trust at the ranch, and you need a chance. She bit her lower lip, turning her gaze toward the window where she knew Lucas was sleeping, weakened, silently fighting the fever that wouldn't break. I can't, she murmured, feeling her resistance slowly breaking, yet still holding. Onto the wounded pride that kept her standing, Cole put his hat back on and began to walk away. Think about it, he said, before getting back into the truck. Grace stood there, watching the vehicle disappear down the muddy road as the rain started falling again, thin and insistent. That night, Lucas had the worst coughing fit yet. Grace spent hours by his side, soaking cloths, holding his hand, whispering through stifled sobs, "Please, stay with me. You're all I have." The next morning, exhausted, she looked at the devastated land around her, at the collapsed fence, the dead pasture, and at the boy sleeping on the worn-out mattress, his face far too pale. She sat on the edge of the bed and squeezed her eyes shut tightly, holding her mother's silver pendant. I can't lose him, not him too. Then she stood up, put on her coat, grabbed the truck keys, and slowly drove to Bennett Ranch, about 30 minutes away, with the rain following every mile like an inevitable omen. When she stopped in front of the massive wooden entrance, with the elegant sign reading Bennett Ranch, she took a deep breath and stepped out of the truck. The ranch felt like another world, impeccable fences, well-cared-for horses, organized barns, everything her farm had once been, and now just a distant memory. Before she could hesitate, she saw Cole coming out of one of the barns, wiping his hands on a rag, and slowly approaching, as if he already knew the reason for her visit. Grace lifted her eyes, fighting not to let the tears fall, and spoke, her voice trembling but determined. "I accept." Cole gave a brief nod, without smiling, but with a look that seemed to say more than any words could at that moment. And without realizing it, Grace was taking the first step toward changing the destiny she believed had already been sealed. Grace woke up that morning to the distant sound of horses in the pasture and the creaking of barn boards being opened. The smell of wet earth and fresh hay filled the small room where she and Lucas were now staying, in a simple but clean cabin next to the main house at Bennett Ranch. It felt strange waking up there, surrounded by solid structures, well-maintained, fences and workers who greeted her with discreet politeness. Unlike her old farm, where decay was visible in every corner, Bennett Ranch seemed to resist time, even though, behind all that order, there was something she couldn't name, a silent absence, an invisible weight. She got up slowly, adjusting, her wavy blonde hair that fell over her shoulders, put on her cotton shirt and worn boots, and looked at Lucas, who was still sleeping, breathing better than he had in recent days. She smiled with relief, stepping out for another day of work. Outside, the sky was clear, but the cold wind blew strong, as if to remind everyone that even in calm weather, the cold was never far away. She walked to the barn, where she saw Cole, as always, alone, saddling one of the horses. He wore dark jeans, a red flannel shirt, and the cowboy hat that shaded his dark green eyes, which rarely revealed what was going on behind that always contained expression. Grace approached, trying not to interrupt what seemed like a silent ritual. "Need help?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Cole let out a small sigh without lifting his gaze. "It's already done," he replied, pulling the strap firmly and then smoothing the horse's shiny coat. Grace stood there, watching the scene. It wasn't just about the horse. There was something about that man that always seemed to be on the edge of a cliff, as if he had learned to live with pain to the point of making it part of his routine. In the days that followed, she noticed that Cole rarely went inside before sunset, preferring to spend endless hours in the fields, fixing fences, organizing the barn, or riding alone to the farthest mountain. It was in the looks of the other workers that Grace began to piece together the story behind that silence. He wasn't always like this, she heard from Ellie, one of the ranch cooks, while helping organize the tool shed. Ellie was a sturdy, middle-aged woman who seemed to know more than she let on. "Like what?" Grace asked, feigning disinterest. Ellie smiled sadly, resting her hands on her hips, closed off, alone, cold. After his wife died, he was never the same. Grace's eyes widened in surprise. He was married. Ellie nodded, looking out at the open fields as if revisiting a painful memory. He loved that woman like I've never seen anyone love. But 5 years ago, she had an accident, fell off her horse on a trail behind the hills. He tried to save her, rushed to the hospital, but couldn't. Grace felt her heart tighten with the image of that scene, one she hadn't even witnessed, but now felt so close. Since then, he shut himself off from everything and everyone. He lives for the ranch, but he doesn't really live, if you know what I mean. Grace just nodded, as the image of Cole, always alone in the field, began to take on a deeper meaning. That night, returning to the cabin, she sat on the edge of the bed where Lucas slept peacefully. She settled into the wooden chair by the window and watched Cole's silhouette in the distance, walking alone along the pasture fence, with his hat low and his hands in his pockets. She felt something strange growing inside her, a mix of gratitude for the help he had offered them and a silent attraction hard to admit even to herself. It wasn't just the strong, determined man that moved her, but also the hidden vulnerability, that pain he hid from everyone, and that somehow made her want to know him more, like someone recognizing themselves in the mirror of their own loneliness. Next day, while feeding the horses, she heard Cole's voice behind her, so sudden it made her jump. "You don't have to wake up so early. You can rest a bit more." She turned, and unable to hold back, replied with a faint smile, "I'm already used to not resting." He stayed silent for a second, like someone who understands but doesn't want to go deeper. "If you need anything," he said, and began to walk away. Grace, on an impulse she didn't even understand herself, called out, "Cole!" He stopped, turning slightly without getting closer. "Thank you for everything." He lowered his head slightly, in a respectful gesture, but didn't reply. Grace stayed there, watching as he walked away once again, feeling her chest tight and confused. She knew she couldn't and shouldn't get involved. But she also knew that it wasn't just gratitude she was feeling anymore. The ranch was prosperous, yes, but every well-made fence, every healthy horse, every green field hid something more. A broken man who lived there, but who, maybe, had stopped truly living a long time ago. And without realizing it, Grace was beginning to wish to be the person who could help him break that silence, or at least understand him. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the cold wind blew across the Montana plains, Grace took a deep breath, realizing that this new life was far from being just a shelter. Maybe it was the beginning of something she herself wouldn't be able to control. The days at the ranch started to flow with an almost comfortable routine for Grace. She woke up early, fed the horses, helped with the maintenance of the barns, and in the late afternoon sat on the cabin porch with Lucas, who seemed stronger with each passing day. The boy ran freely through the pasture, smiling in a way Grace thought she would never see again. That afternoon, the sky was clear and the air dry, sharp as it typically was in Montana, when Grace, coming out of the stable with a bucket of feed, spotted a truck parked at the main entrance of the ranch. It wasn't just any truck. It was an old black pickup with scratched sides and a cracked windshield, one she knew all too well. Her heart immediately started racing. She dropped the bucket on the ground and walked hesitantly toward the fence, where she saw leaning against the side of the vehicle, with a worn felt hat and mud-caked boots, a tall, thin man with a scruffy beard and a crooked smile she could never forget. Raymond Doyle, the former owner of the farm where she had lived with her parents, a man known in the region for his lack of scruples, who had always circled her family like a vulture, waiting for the final fall. Grace stopped a few meters away, holding her ground, but with her stomach in knots. "Raymond, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice dry, trying to hide her apprehension. He smiled, crossing his arms with the confidence of someone who had already planned every move. "Just came to deliver something to you, darling," he replied, pulling a crumpled brown envelope from his back pocket and extending it toward her. Grace hesitated, but took the envelope with trembling hands, opening it quickly. As she read the papers, she felt the blood drain from her face. "This is impossible," she murmured, scanning the lines that stated with stamps and signatures that the property where she had lived with her family was mortgaged, and that she, as the legal heir, owed an exorbitant amount, more than she could ever pay in her entire life. "You know this is a lie. My parents never—" she began, her voice choked. Raymond let out a low, cynical laugh. "Documents, Grace. The only thing that matters is the documents, and these say you owe me big time." She clenched the envelope tightly, feeling the paper crumple in her fingers. "I don't have that kind of money. And even if I did, this is forged. I know it." Raymond leaned in, slightly, bringing his face closer to hers, his breath thick with tobacco. "Maybe. But who's going to listen to you? A broke girl, no lawyer, no family, just a sick brother to take care of." Grace's body shuddered at the mention of Lucas. "Leave him out of this," she exclaimed, her voice firm but her heart in pieces. Raymond took 2 steps back, raising his hands as if he didn't want to fight, but with the same venomous smile. "If you don't pay off the debt, I'll have to go through the courts. And given the situation, well, I think the judge will understand that your brother would be better off under the care of someone more stable." The words hit Grace like a knife. The fear, which had been dormant since she arrived at the ranch, woke up in full force, squeezing her chest in a suffocating grip. "You won't get away with this," she whispered, but her voice no longer sounded so sure. Raymond calmly turned, opening the truck door, and before getting in, he looked over his shoulder, delivering one last warning. "You've got 30 days. Then he started the noisy engine and left, leaving behind a trail of dust and the bitter taste of a threat. Grace stood there, with the crumpled envelope in her hands, her legs trembling as she watched the truck disappear down the road that cut through the Golden Hills. She took a deep breath, trying to keep control, but her eyes filled with involuntary tears. She looked around at the organized ranch, at the vast Montana sky, and for the first time since accepting the job, she felt that maybe everything could collapse again, as quickly as it had started to come together. She ran to the cabin, slammed the door shut, and leaned against it, sliding down to the floor. Clutching the envelope tightly to her chest, Lucas appeared at the bedroom door, rubbing his eyes, wearing the light blue pajamas Ellie had sewn for him days earlier. "Grace, is everything okay?" he asked, his voice sleepy. She forced a smile, quickly wiping away the tears. "Yeah, go back to sleep, champ." He smiled back, trusting in his sister's strength, and went back to bed. Grace closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, but inside, panic was already spreading like fire through dry straw. She knew Raymond wouldn't give up, and that if she didn't find a way out, she would lose not only the ranch that had once belonged to her family, but also the only person she still loved in the world. She stood up slowly, looking out the window at the open field, where Cole was riding alone, as he did every morning. For a second she thought about asking for help, but quickly pushed the idea away. "No, I can do this," alone. But deep down, she knew that this time, maybe it wouldn't be enough. And as night fell over the Montana plains and the cold wind blew through the cracks in the window, Grace felt that the biggest battle of her life was just beginning. In the days that followed, Grace could barely sleep. Raymond's envelope seemed to weigh a ton, hidden in the back of the cabin drawer. Every time she closed her eyes, she relived the threats, the cold and calculated words he had let slip, as if he already knew he would come out victorious. And while she tried to find a way out, Grace began to investigate discreetly, looking around town for any clue about how that absurd debt had come about. It was on a cloudy afternoon at the old stationery store in town that she overheard the conversation that changed everything. While Lucas picked out a notebook to draw in, she was waiting, in line, when two men started talking on the other side of the counter. Yeah, they say that Sullivan Ranch was already in debt back when Cole and Raymond were partners. Grace felt her heart stop. Partners, she repeated softly, as if the word made no sense. The man continued laughing. That was before everything went wrong. Before Cole's wife died. After that, he gave it all up, shut himself off. But there was a time they were partners. Grace stood frozen, as if the ground had vanished beneath her feet. She left the line, grabbed Lucas by the hand, and walked out of the store, her chest heaving, not even noticing the light rain starting to fall. As she got into the truck, she gripped the steering wheel tightly, her breathing quickening. He knew, she murmured, staring at the windshield. The pieces began to fit together in her mind, painfully and inevitably. The generous offer, the sudden help. And now, the revelation that years ago, Cole Bennett and Raymond Doyle had been partners. Grace felt her stomach turn. Could he have known from the beginning? She thought, tears starting to fill her eyes. She drove back to the ranch with her mind in turmoil. The images of Cole helping her, his restrained gaze, their quiet conversations. It all now seemed to carry another meaning, hidden and treacherous. When she parked in front of the cabin, she saw Cole in the distance near the barn, organizing some tools. He lifted his head and, upon seeing her, gave a slight smile, like he always did. But this time she couldn't return it. She hurried into the cabin, shut the door hard and leaned against it, sliding down to the floor, hugging her knees as the restrained sobs finally overtook her. Lucas, confused, came closer. Grace, what's wrong? She looked up, quickly wiping away the tears, trying to maintain the strength she always tried to show him. Nothing, champ. We just need to pack up. He frowned, confused. But why? It's so nice here. Grace swallowed hard, fighting against the lump in her throat. Just trust me. That night, while Cole prepared for yet another solitary ride, Grace silently packed their few clothes into an old suitcase. She didn't leave a note, didn't look for explanations. She just took the boy by the hand, put him in the pickup, and with an empty stare left, driving down the dirt road once again, this time without looking back. Hours later, when Cole entered the cabin to inform them about the change in work for the next day, he found the room empty, the bed made, and a silence that hurt more than any scream. He stood at the doorway, the hat still in his hands, looking at the space where just hours before there had been life, the laughter of a child, and the quiet presence of a woman who had begun to take up more space inside him than he wanted to admit. He crossed the room, opened the drawer next to the bed, and saw, forgotten there, the crumpled envelope with Raymond's name printed on the front. He grabbed the paper, read it quickly, and as he understood, let out a long sigh, squeezing the envelope tightly. Grace. No, he murmured, closing his eyes, feeling his throat tighten. Outside, the sky was darkening quickly, signaling yet another storm coming over Montana's silent hills. And he stood there, devastated, not fully understanding the sudden flight. But deep down, feeling that once again he had lost someone he might never have had the courage to try to keep close. The days following Grace's escape were marked by an oppressive silence. The road felt endless as she drove to the neighboring town of Livingston, where she managed, with the little money she had saved, to rent an old trailer tucked behind a gas station. The space was cramped, with rusty furniture and the permanent smell of mildew, but it was the only place she could call home at that moment. The first night there was cold and silent. Lucas, curled up on the makeshift bed with borrowed blankets, asked softly, "Grace, are we going back to the ranch?" She closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, and answered without looking at him, "No, champ, this is our home now." The boy nodded slowly, clutching the same worn-out teddy bear that had been with him since their parents' accident. Grace ran her hand through his hair, like she always did, to comfort him, then looked out the trailer's narrow window, where the wind swayed the dry trees beneath a cloudy sky. The next day, with her bank account nearly empty and desperation knocking at the door, Grace walked to Livingston's main street and entered the only diner open that early in the morning. The walls were covered with dark wooden panels. The formica tables were old, and the air smelled of burnt coffee. She approached the counter, where a woman with graying hair and a floral apron was wiping mugs with an already worn-out cloth. "Are you hiring?" she asked, her voice more firm than she felt. The woman looked her up and down, like someone who had already seen dozens of desperate young women walk through that door, and nodded. "You can start tomorrow. Doesn't pay much, but it's what there is." Grace smiled, relieved, but also with a twinge of sadness at the certainty that once again she was accepting far less than she deserved. "Thank you. I need it." And so, every morning before the sun even rose, she dropped Lucas off at the small public school in town, a brick building with an old rusty playground in the back, and headed to the diner, where she spent hours, serving coffee, wiping tables, and listening to the indifferent conversations of truckers passing through town. Despite her efforts to keep a routine, both of their emotional health began to deteriorate. Lucas, once so cheerful at the ranch, now walked with his head down, dragging his heavy backpack along the sidewalks. Grace did everything she could to hide her exhaustion, but the deep, dark circles under her eyes and her calloused hands gave away the unbearable weight she carried. On cold nights in the trailer, she helped him with homework under the weak light of a hanging bulb. While trying to ignore the constant worry about social workers, she knew that if they discovered the precarious conditions they were living in, they might question her ability to care for her brother. "I'm fine. You don't need to worry about me," Lucas always said whenever he noticed his sister's distant look. Grace forced a smile, but her chest tightened. "I'm always going to worry about you. Always." But what hurt the most was the feeling that despite all the sacrifice, she was failing. On some mornings, as she stepped out of the trailer and watched the dust rise under her feet while walking to the diner, she couldn't stop the image of Cole from appearing in her mind. She mentally saw Bennett Ranch, the green fields, the spacious house, and above all that silent look of his, the one she now tried to hate, but that insisted on visiting her in her most vulnerable moments. He knew, and still he helped me. Or was that exactly why he got close? She whispered to herself as she wiped the tables with automatic motions. Pride kept her from looking for answers. She preferred to endure the silent sacrifice rather than risk hearing a truth that would destroy her completely. One night, after closing the diner and returning to the trailer with her apron still stained with coffee, she found Lucas sitting on the small steps, staring at the starry sky. "Why did we leave, Grace?" he asked bluntly. She sat next to him, hugging her knees and looking at the same sky, where the stars seemed as distant as her old dreams. "Because sometimes we have to walk away, even when it hurts." He rested his head on her shoulder, and both stayed in silence, listening only to the sound of the wind crossing the empty streets of the small town. Grace closed her eyes, breathing deeply, while her heart pulsed in a painful rhythm. And at that moment, even with everything falling apart, she decided she would keep fighting. For Lucas, for their parents' memory, and for herself. But she didn't know that fate, silently, was already plotting another twist that once again would change everything. The weeks turned into months, and the routine in the trailer seemed to have become a sentence with no end date. Grace, with eyes increasingly dull, kept working long hours at the diner, while Lucas, silent, grew used to the cold and rootless environment of their new life. But what she didn't know was that every morning, as she crossed Livingston's dusty streets, there was someone who hadn't stopped looking for her. Cole. Since the day he found the forgotten envelope in the cabin and understood the reason behind her sudden escape, he had found no peace. He hired private investigators, contacted friends in nearby towns, searched through employment and school enrollment records. For months, he lived between the ranch and endless roads, sleeping in cheap motels, always hoping to find some clue. Until, one cold morning, stopped at a small gas station to fill up his truck. He saw in the distance the familiar figure of a woman in a faded flannel shirt, hurrying across the street, pulling along a thin boy with a backpack on his back. His heart pounded. "Grace," he murmured, his voice choked. He got out of the truck without thinking, crossed the dirt street, and stopped a few feet away when she, turning her head to call Lucas, locked eyes with him. Time seemed to freeze. Grace widened her eyes, paralyzed, as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Cole?" she said, almost in a whisper. He slowly removed his hat, as he always did when he wanted to show respect. "Grace, I needed to see you." She took a deep breath, instinctively shielding Lucas behind her, as if the instinct to protect was stronger than anything else. "Why? Isn't everything that's already happened enough?" She shot back, her voice trembling but trying to stay firm. Cole took a step forward but stopped when he saw her wounded look. "I need to explain everything." Grace crossed her arms, feeling her chest tighten, still trying to figure out if this was a nightmare or the chance to finally hear what she'd never had the courage to ask. "There's nothing left to say." "Yes, there is," Cole interrupted, with more force than he intended, but quickly softened his tone. "I never knew Raymond was going after you, and I never went along with what he did." Grace shut her eyes tightly, shaking her head like someone trying to push that possibility away. "But you were partners. I heard—" Cole took a deep breath, stepping one more time closer until he could speak, looking directly into her eyes. "I was a partner. Years ago, before I knew who he really was. When I found out, I cut all ties. And not only that." He shoved his hand into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope, the same kind of brown envelope she feared so much, but now with different documents inside. He held it out to her, his hand steady. Grace hesitated but took it, opening it with trembling hands. As she read, her eyes filled with tears. It was the record of the payment of the supposed debt Raymond had claimed, fully paid off. And more than that, the documentation proving the annulment of the forge process, guaranteeing that Lucas was legally under her permanent custody. I don't understand," she stammered, feeling her legs weaken. Cole took a deep breath, running his hand down his face, like someone trying to find the right words after being silent for so long. "When you left, I knew I had to fix everything. I couldn't let you fight alone, against a man like him." Grace brought her hand to her mouth, holding back her sobs, while Lucas beside her watched without fully understanding, but sensing the tension of the moment. Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice broken as if the question was more for herself than for him. Cole took a final step forward, standing close enough for her to feel his restrained breath, and answered, his eyes filled with tears. "Because I love you, Grace." The words, spoken with disarming simplicity, broke the last wall she was still trying to keep standing. She looked away, letting the tears finally fall as she clutched the papers against her chest. I don't know what to say." Cole gently lifted her chin, making her look at him. "You don't have to say anything, just don't run away anymore." Grace closed her eyes for a second, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of suffering slowly melt away, like snow dissolving at the first sign of sun. When she opened her eyes, she saw standing there, in front of her, not the man she had feared, but the one who had silently fought alongside her, even from afar. I don't know if I can," she murmured sincerely, but for the first time without that automatic resistance. Cole nodded, respecting her pace. "I just want you to know you're not alone." He then crouched down to Lucas's level and extended his hand. "Hey, champ, remember me?" The boy smiled shyly and shook his hand. Grace watched the scene, her heart still tight, but now filled with something new, something she hadn't felt worthy of for a long time: hope. And as the cold wind blew through the silent streets of Livingston, she knew that this twist wasn't just about justice, but about redemption. She just didn't imagine that, even after all of this, fate still had one more surprise in store. 2 days after that conversation in front of the gas station, Grace took Lucas to the city park. The small area with sparse grass and worn-out wooden playground equipment was the only refuge where the boy could run free without worrying about the cramped trailer or the pitying looks at school. She was sitting on one of the benches, watching Lucas carefully climb the slide structure when she heard firm, familiar steps approaching along the gravel path. Her heart raced before she could even look. When she lifted her eyes, there was Cole, standing a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his grey wool coat, his cowboy hat under his arm, and his gaze fixed on her, filled with a mixture of courage and vulnerability. Grace felt the air leave her lungs for a moment. She wanted to get up and run, or scream, or hide, but she couldn't do anything except sit there, with her fingers involuntarily gripping the edge of the bench. Cole took a few steps, stopping in front of her, with the park silent around them, except for the sound of dry leaves being swept by the wind. "I didn't come to pressure you or ask for anything," he began, his voice deep but restrained, as if he were choosing every word carefully. "I just needed to say one last thing." Grace bit her lower lip, keeping her eyes fixed on Lucas, who was now running through the grass, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "I know I made mistakes, that I hid things, that maybe I scared you with everything that happened," he continued, taking a deep breath before adding, "but it was never my intention to hurt you." She finally looked at him, her eyes filled with tears. Why did you do all that? Paying off the debt, hiring lawyers, protecting me? And you didn't tell me?" she asked, her voice broken. Cole moved closer, sitting beside her on the bench, but keeping a respectful distance. "Because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. I just wanted you to have peace." Grace slowly turned her face, looking into those dark green eyes that for the first time seemed completely unguarded. "And why?" she insisted, even though she might have already known the answer. Cole let out a long sigh, as if releasing years of silence and resistance. "Because I love you, Grace." The words hung in the air, heavy and sweet at the same time, like a confession breaking through all defenses. She brought her hand to her mouth, feeling the tears run silently down her cheeks, while her chest tightened in an almost unbearable way. "I never," she tried to say, but her voice failed. Cole lowered his head, accepting that silence as an answer, and began to stand up. "I just wanted you to know. I don't expect anything. I just wanted you to know that someone will always be by your side without asking for anything in return." He began to slowly walk away down the path, while Grace remained seated, frozen, her chest exploding with conflicting emotions. She looked again at Lucas, who at that moment was running toward her, laughing, his cheeks rosy from the cold, and realized, like a sudden spark, that for the first time in her life, someone had loved and protected her unconditionally, not as someone offering shelter out of pity, but as someone recognizing and valuing her strength. Without thinking, she stood up suddenly. "Cole!" she shouted, making him stop immediately and turn around, his eyes surprised and hopeful. She ran up to him, stopping just a few inches away, her eyes still full of tears, but now with steady breathing. I don't want to run anymore." He frowned slightly, confused. "So..." Grace smiled through her tears and finished. "I want to come back, not as your employee, but as your partner. Cole's eyes filled with light as he took off his hat and held it against his chest, as if honoring not just the woman in front of him, but everything she represented. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low but full of emotion. Grace nodded, reaching out her hand to him. "I'm sure." He took her hand, pulling her gently into a tight embrace where for the first time Grace allowed herself to rest and trust. Lucas, noticing the two of them hugging, ran over and joined the embrace, wrapping his small arms around them both. There, in the middle of the simple park, with dry leaves falling around and the sun beginning to set behind the mountains, Grace realized that her life had finally found a path not driven by fear, but chosen out of love. She just didn't imagine that the biggest challenge was still to come. Months passed since that reunion in the park. The Montana landscape, which once seemed barren and silent, now bloomed in vibrant colors around Bennett Ranch, as if life had decided to renew itself along with them. The ranch, once marked by heavy silences and solitary routines, was now filled every morning with the sound of Lucas's laughter as he ran among the horses, proudly helping to feed them, thrilled with the new role he had earned. His green eyes, once dulled by fever and fear, now shone with the freedom and joy typical of a protected childhood. Grace watched this scene from the porch of the main house, a slight smile on her face, as she adjusted the delicate white cotton dress that draped softly over her body. Her hands trembled slightly, not out of nervousness, but from the intensity of the moment that was approaching. Cole appeared at the barn door, wearing dark jeans, a white shirt, and the cowboy hat that, this time, he held in his hands as if paying reverence to something sacred. When he saw her, he paused for a second, admiring the woman who, months ago, had crossed the road as if carrying the weight of the world, but who now walked toward him with lightness and certainty. Friends and neighbors began gathering under the large tree at the center of the ranch, where wooden planks had been carefully arranged to form a simple altar, adorned only with wildflowers gathered from the field itself. Among the guests, faces that once looked down on her now smiled with respect. Men and women who used to cross the street to avoid the unlucky orphan now raised glasses and shook her hand with sincerity. Ellie, the ranch cook, had organized everything. She laid out cakes and homemade pies that she and Grace had prepared together, between conversations and laughter, like two longtime friends. Grace walked up to Cole, who welcomed her with a look so deep that it rendered any words unnecessary. The justice of the peace, an elderly man with a kind expression, went through the brief formalities, but it was Grace who, in the end, held Cole's hands and, in front of everyone, took a deep breath and shared, with a voice trembling but firm, The lesson that this long journey had taught her: sometimes love isn't what we look for, but what finds us when we least expect it, she said, looking at Cole and then at Lucas, who stood proudly beside them, holding the rings on a linen pillow. It's not about being rescued, but about accepting being loved. The words echoed across the field, among the whisper of the wind and the distant song of birds. Some guests discreetly wiped away tears, moved by the simple strength of that truth. Cole gently squeezed her hands and whispered, "I love you." Grace smiled as Lucas came closer and hugged them both tightly, forming a bond that nothing could ever break. When the justice declared them officially married, the applause broke out spontaneously, and the ranch, once silent, now vibrated with life, hope, and celebration. By the end of the afternoon, as the last guests left and the string lights swayed gently between the trees, Grace and Cole walked hand in hand through the pasture, watching Lucas play with one of the newborn foals. Grace leaned, her head on Cole's shoulder, and closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the scent of wet earth and hay, feeling, for the first time, complete. "I thought I had to be strong. Alone," she murmured. Cole wrapped his arm around her and answered, his voice low and certain, "Now we're strong, together." And at that moment, as the sun disappeared behind the mountains that once seemed so distant and insurmountable, Grace knew with absolute certainty that no one has to carry the weight of pain alone. The ranch, once a backdrop of silences and absences, was now a refuge of love, rebuilding, and life, and so a cycle closed, not as an ending, but as the beginning of everything she once believed impossible. So what did you think of this story? I'd really love to know your opinion. Leave your rating from 0 to 10 in the comments, sharing how much this story touched your heart. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share it with someone who loves emotional stories, and subscribe to the channel to follow all the next stories I prepare with so much care. And before you go, I've set aside another touching story that will definitely move your heart even more. Enjoy.